Chapter 35-44. He hugged Su Fu tightly, his fingers clasped tightly for fear of offending him. What Su Fu felt was a strange masculine aura completely enveloping her. Her body trembled and her legs were a little weak. She was even a little addicted and didn't want to get up or leave. Hao Yun's hand clumsily helped her button, but he only managed to button one after a long time. Wherever his finger went, there would be chaos of soldiers and horses. Hao Yun smiled bitterly and let go of his hand. I've never helped a woman put on her clothes. Su Fu lowered her head and buttoned the button with trembling hands. She didn't turn around for a long time and just whispered, "Then have you ever taken off a woman's clothes?" This was an extremely sensitive topic. Hao Yun was usually swift and decisive, but at this time, he was at a loss. Because it was in front of the woman he liked. He hesitated for a moment and said, "No, never." Su Fu's mood was extremely complicated. She slowly turned around and looked at Hao Yun. She slowly hugged him, and his body was extremely stiff. She put her face on his shoulder and said very slowly and softly, "Hao Yun, I've already given birth to 2 children for others. I'm not young anymore. You can actually find a younger woman to spend the rest of your life with." He looked down at her and said in a hoarse voice, "But you hugged me." His hand slowly lowered, bit by bit, and finally landed on her back. Finally, he hugged her hard. Su Fu's body trembled, and she tried her best to control her expression. For the first time, she was hugged by a man other than her husband, and this person was also someone around Yizhengang. She knew that it was wrong of her, but at such a vulnerable time, she wanted to hug him. She wanted to be hugged by him. Everything seemed to be in chaos. In the end, Hao Yun couldn't control himself and kissed her. Their soft lips came into contact with each other, and he couldn't even bear it. He had never known that women could be so soft and fragile, as if they were about to shatter with a single touch. But very quickly, his manly instincts made him hug her tightly. Kissing her like a storm, he kissed her almost crazily. His large palm landed on her shoulder, and his eyes were dyed with a layer of black. "Can I?" He had no such intention, he did not want to possess her, at least not now. But he couldn't seem to stop. A man who had abstained from sex for decades was almost instantly aroused. Su Fu didn't say anything. He just looked up at him. She had read all the books he had brought her, and she had liked all those little gifts. He understood her. She didn't have any scruples. She wanted this man to hug her. She was even afraid that he would change his mind. Because of the existence of Yizhengang, Su Fu decided to sacrifice himself. This was a crazy decision. She unbuttoned her shirt. She wanted him to love her. She wanted to be Hao Yun's woman. Hao Yun got over his excitement and hugged her, even with her clothes on. He pressed his lips against her neck and said in a hoarse voice, "Su Fu, don't be rash. Don't you want me? Or do you regret it?" She asked in a low voice. Hao Yun closed her eyes and said, "No. Because you deserve the best." He wanted to, but he couldn't have sex with her in this situation. It wouldn't be fair to her. She was emotionally unstable and fragile. She should think it through. She should be with him when she was prepared. Su Fu did not say anything else. She just hugged him, this man whom she had known for many years and was 2 years younger than her. Chapter 35-45. Yizhengang stood at the door of the ward and looked at them in shock. His most trusted subordinate and his wife, they were hugging each other. He squinted his eyes and his breathing almost stopped. Su Fu's clothes were messy, but the way she hugged Hao Yun was not the same as before. Moreover, she was hugging Hao Yun's hand so tightly. It was absolutely impossible to say that there was no ambiguous relationship between them. They were having an affair. Yi Xinggang narrowed his eyes and said in a deep voice, "You guys, when did it happen?" The people in the ward were shocked and then separated. Yi Xinggang shouted, "Tell me, when did it happen?" He was furious now. His subordinate and his wife were having an affair, but he was still acting like a fool. How laughable, how laughable. He had trusted Hao Yun so much, telling her everything that was on his mind. When he left just now, he thought that Hao Yun was steady and could comfort Su Fu, but how could he comfort her? He even comforted her on the bed. Yi Xinggang felt that it was very ironic. He felt that he was an idiot. He was furious and angry and he was about to go crazy. Hao Yun put his coat on Su Fu's shoulders. In Yi Mulin's eyes, it was also extremely glaring. He shouted angrily, "Tell me, when did it happen?" "Just now." Su Fu was extremely calm. "We are going to divorce." "Yi Xinggang, you don't expect me to keep my chastity for you." Yi Xinggang stared at her and laughed sinisterly, "You're much more open-minded." "Did Su Fu seduce you?" "No, I seduced him," Su Fu said fearlessly. At this moment, Hao Yun sighed softly, "I liked her for many years." He didn't flinch and looked straight at Yi Xinggang. "I want to marry her." Yi Xinggang sneered as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. He looked at them. "Why do you want to marry her?" "She is still my wife." "Don't forget your own identity," Hao Yun said in a neither servile nor overbearing manner, "because I love her." Yi Xinggang's mind went blank for a moment as he said these words with great determination. He thought of the vow he made on the altar when he married Su Fu. He said that no matter if he was poor or rich, healthy or sick, he would love Su Fu and would never leave her. However, they were still well now and they had already broken the vow. Yi Xinggang looked at Su Fu and said in a desolate voice, "What about you? Do you also like him? Do you want to be with him?" Su Fu lowered her eyes. When she looked up again, her eyes were filled with unprecedented determination. "Yes, I like him. I want to be with him." Yi Xinggang felt as if he had been struck by lightning and did not come back to his senses for a long time. When he came back to his senses, he murmured, "You're crazy. You must be crazy. Have you forgotten the vows we made when we got married? The one who forgot is you." Su Fu closed his eyes. "Yi Xinggang, we've reached the end." Yi Xinggang had made it through the most difficult part. At this time, his mood had calmed down a lot. His expression also became cold. "Su Fu, I have to take you away." Su Fu looked at him in shock. "You can't." "I can." He stared at her and Hao Yun. "I'm your husband." After saying that, he walked out. Then, two men came in to catch Su Fu. Hao Yun couldn't stop them. After all, he was a scholar. Chapter 35-46. Hao Yun still stood there quietly, and said indifferently, "I don't regret it." Yi Xinggang slowly walked over, looked at his former beloved general, and said in a low voice, "You don't regret it? Do you know how much I love her?" Hao Yun's face tensed up, and his voice was filled with restraint. "I don't know how much you love her, I only know that you hurt her, and that Xia Anning appeared by your side. How can a woman like Su Fu endure it? How is Xia Anning better than Su Fu, tell me? She's my wife, you don't need to care about this." Yi Xinggang growled with a disappointed expression, "Hao Yun, you disappoint me too much. From today onwards, you don't have to stay by Mu Lin's side anymore." Hao Yun's tensed-up body seemed to have broken. He looked at Yi Xinggang, and said very softly, "You're saying, if you want me to leave Mu Lin, then you'll let your own son face a group of wolf-like people alone." As he said that, his voice became louder. "Do you know what kind of life he has been living for the past year? You always think that what is best for them, but have you ever thought that this is what they want? Have you ever thought about what would happen to me, Mulin? Yi Xinggang's voice was cold. I am his father, what are you? Hao Yun gave an extremely complicated chuckle. I will be his stepfather. As he said that, he walked out, and when he reached the door, he said indifferently, I will not leave, I will wait for her. He turned his head, his eyes red. Yi Xinggang shouted angrily, bastard. Hao Yun walked out, but Yi Xinggang did not leave that night. In H City, no matter how big the matter was, it was not as big as a fire in the backyard. When the sky brightened, he walked into Yi Mulin's ward. Bai Shuoli was still guarding him and did not sleep. Yi Xinggang stood at the door and watched for a while before walking in. His expression was extremely tired, and he looked as if he had aged a lot in an instant. Bai Shuoli saw him get up. Yi Xinggang glanced at his son, who was still unconscious. At this moment, he had no one to confide in, so he turned to Bai Shuoli and said, You. Auntie, she's taking things too hard. She actually chose Hao Yun. Bai Shuoli was actually very sad because Yi Mulin was lying here and it made her heart ache. However, when Yi Xinggang said this, she was really confused. What did he mean? Auntie. Was she Yi Mulin's mother? Was she also the person she used to call mom? Yi Xinggang walked over and stood beside the bed to look at his son. He whispered, his mother refuses to change her mind and wants to be with Hao Yun. Do you think Mulin will agree? Bai Shuoli shook her head. I don't know. Maybe he will agree. Yi Xinggang's expression changed, and his voice became stern. Why? Bai Shuoli looked at him and smiled. If he was like you, I wouldn't be here, wouldn't I? Yi Xinggang looked at her and felt a little complicated. He had always thought that this girl was not worthy of his son. She was not even worthy of Mulin's feelings. However, he had a feeling that Bai Shuoli did not know what had happened, but she vaguely understood Mulin's feelings. She understood Mulin's deep love, so she was willing to stay by Mulin's side and was willing to be here. At this moment, Yi Mulin woke up. He looked at them with his head tilted, and his voice was a little weak. Shuoli, help me up. Chapter 35-47. Yi Mulin looked at her and struggled to sit up. Help me up. Be obedient. How could he be obedient? Bai Shuoli didn't want to and glared at him. Yi Mulin stared into her eyes and said again, help me up. She was unwilling but she couldn't refuse. She helped him up carefully and put a pillow behind his waist. She even lifted the quilt to look at the wound. If it wasn't for the situation, Yi Mulin would have laughed at her little action. He sat down. Although it was a little painful, he could bear it. He lowered his head and said to Bai Shuoli, go get me a glass of water. You can't drink water. The doctor said so. She bit her lips and looked at him. Yi Mulin stared at her. His entire body was weak, but his gaze was especially bright and full of tenderness. Bai Shuoli lowered her head and went to get the water. She said softly, it can only moisten my lips. He nodded. Their interaction made Yi Xinggang uncomfortable. He stared at his son. Mulin, you, think about when you on. There's no conflict. Yi Mulin whispered. Dad, you said Uncle Hao and my mother. What's wrong? Yi Xinggang felt that his son did it on purpose. Didn't he hear it clearly just now? Why did he have to say that he was a cuckold? But no matter what, he still said, your mother wants to be with Hao Yun. Hao Yun can't stay. Yi Mulin looked at his father and said calmly, you have someone else. Why don't you let go? No one will be in a difficult position. Yi Xinggang was stunned. Mulin, what did you say? Yi Mulin whispered, I want my mother to be happy. It was probably a man's idea. In Yi Mulin's heart, his mother needed to be protected. The only time he begged his mother was for Shueli. That time, his mother broke up with his father for them. This time, he chose to protect her, and Hao Yun. Yi Xinggang was furious. He paced back and forth in the ward. He stopped and looked at his son. Mulin, are you crazy? She's your mother. How could you let her be with another man, a man who watched you grow up? He has liked my mother for many years. Yi Mulin was unusually calm. Yi Xinggang carefully looked at his son and suddenly realized, Mulin, did you already know? Yi Mulin thought for a moment and nodded. Yes, I can tell that for a long time. Ever since Hao Yun gave him the first book, he had known about it. However, he never pointed it out because Hao Yun's love and persistence towards his mother was something that his mother deserved. A woman was not destined to love only one man after giving birth to a child. If the man wasn't good, the woman could still find a new relationship, and Hao Yun happened to be the most suitable person. Yi Xinggang stared at his son with a strange gaze. After a long time, he whispered, You are very good. Mulin, are you taking revenge on me? Never. Yi Mulin whispered, I just feel that if you still love her, you should give her happiness. Bullshit. Yi Xinggang cursed. He was so angry that he was panting. What kind of theory is that? Yi Mulin, you are really good. He turned around. I will kill him now. I want to see who else your mother can be happy with. Chapter 35-48. Yi Xinggang bellowed, You're rebelling, who's your father? Yi Mulin gently lifted the blanket. His movements were extremely slow, but every slight movement made people feel shocked. Bai Shueli pressed down on his hand, You can't get off the bed. He grabbed her hand and used the strength of her hand to stand up. When he stood on the ground, his body was a little unstable and swayed for a moment, but he immediately stabilized himself. Step by step, he walked towards Yi Xinggang and finally stood face to face. One was furious, the other was incomparably weak. They were father and son, but at this moment, they were opposing each other. In terms of aura, no one was weaker than the other. Yi Mulin looked at his father and said word by word, I want to protect my mother, so you can't touch Hao Yun. Yi Xinggang squinted his eyes, Your mother is still my wife, how can she be with Hao Yun? What about Xia and Ning? Yi Mulin said coldly, What is her role in your marriage? Yi Xinggang clenched his fists, Mulin is different, I have never thought of divorce. Betrayal is betrayal, what's the difference? Yi Mulin's face was as pale as paper, and he only gave his father one sentence, In mother's heart, her perfect world has long been destroyed. Yi Xinggang's body swayed, his expression was extremely ugly. He looked at his son in disbelief, Mulin, don't you want me to reconcile with your mother? I do, but I want her to be happy. Yi Mulin said as he held on to his lower abdomen. Bai Shueli wanted to go forward to help him up, but was gently pushed away by him. He stared at his father and said firmly, Let her go. Yi Xinggang chuckled, What about you, would you rather watch Bai Shueli get married? Watch her get together with someone else? Mulin, what's the difference between us? Why are you making things difficult for father? Yi Mulin's eyes were bloodshot, Dad, don't you know if I have betrayed her or not? Under such a strong pressure, Yi Xinggang was actually a little afraid. This son of his actually didn't retreat at all. He wanted to fight to the death with him. Yi Xinggang glared at his son. Yi Mulin did not retreat. Bai Shueli stood beside him and did not say a word. She vaguely understood something. Biting her lips, she looked at Yi Mulin. His words kept echoing in her mind, Dad, don't you know if I betrayed her or not? What did he mean? Her eyes were a little misty, and she didn't dare to think further. Yi Xingang sighed. Mu Lin, are you threatening me? I wouldn't dare. Yi Mu Lin smiled bitterly. How would I dare? Dad, you can make me suffer a fate worse than death with just a few tricks. You can also make my mother suffer a fate worse than death and lock her up in a cage for the rest of her life. How would we dare? All of us live under your power, including Mubai. Yi Xingang was completely defeated by these words. He closed his eyes. Is that how you all think of me? Yi Mulin did not answer, but gave him an extremely complicated expression. Yi Xingang did not stay any longer and stumbled out. When he walked to the door, he held onto the door frame and said bleakly, Mu Lin, believe it or not, the only person I have ever loved in this life is your mother. After saying that, he gritted his teeth and left. Chapter 35-49. Help me to lie down on the bed. He said hoarsely. Oh. She hurriedly helped him over and took care of him carefully. After Yi Mulin lay down, the gauze under his lower abdomen started to bleed. He was afraid that she would be scared, so he said with difficulty in a calm tone, Go and call the doctor. Bai Shuali stared at him and asked softly, Are you okay? He looked up at her with a gentle gaze. Bai Shuali ran over to call the doctor, but she turned back after taking 2 steps. She knelt on the bed and hugged him carefully before running away. Yi Mulin's face was very pale, but he looked at her back as she ran away and smiled very lightly. He smiled blissfully. Bai Shuali, you silly girl. He had never betrayed her, but he wished that all the pain she had suffered in the past had never happened, including the unborn child. He closed his eyes to hide the pain in his dark eyes. The doctor came very soon and Bai Shuali was beside him with a nervous face. The doctor checked and said softly, The wound is a little bleeding but it's okay. You just need to change the dressing. With that said, the nurse handed over the tools. After the doctor changed the dressing quickly, he still advised, Boss Yi, it's better not to get off the bed these 2 days. It's better to rest quietly. If you work, it's best to rest for half a month. Normally, you need to rest for a month. Your health is the most important, don't overwork yourself. Yi Mulin grunted heavily. Bai Shuali reminded him, the doctor said that I need a month before I can work. Yi Mulin glanced at her and smiled lightly. He had always been good-looking. Even now when he was sick, he still looked good when he smiled. Bai Shuali looked at him and said pitifully. Yi Mulin lay down and looked at her gently. Shuali, go make some porridge for me. Do you know how to make porridge now? Yes. She bit her lip. The nurse's heart softened a little. Boss Ye's voice when he called her Shuali was really nice to hear. The doctor took the nurse away. There were only Yi Mulin and Bai Shuali in the ward. She was making porridge in the kitchen. Her voice was soft but he felt very happy when he heard it. Yi Mulin lay down and fell asleep unknowingly. Bai Shuali saw that he had fallen asleep after making the porridge. She didn't wake him up, wanting him to sleep a little longer. She sat by the bed and looked at him. She couldn't control her hand and gently stroked his eyebrows. She heard that sentence again. Don't you know if I have ever betrayed her? She bit her lip and her fingers traced from his handsome eyebrows to his straight nose and then to his lips. His lips were thin, but delicately shaped, and when he kissed her in anger they were strangely cold, but at other times they were strangely hot, and as volatile as his temper. Bai Shuali, of the words. Bai of my feelings. Yi. His dark eyes stared at her, and his voice was extremely hoarse. What are your thoughts? Startled, she met his eyes and stammered, What feelings can I have? I don't have any feelings at all. I I, 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 of, ye, she said. She. Chapter 35-50. He looked at her and smiled. You'll feed me. She stuttered again and stared at his face. Then, as if she had made up her mind, she said, I'll feed you. She helped him sit up and gave him a pillow. She took the porridge and sat beside him to feed him. Yi Mulin drank a bowl of porridge quietly. She asked him if he wanted more. He stared at her and said quietly, yes. Bai Shuali blushed and bit her lip as she stared at him. Yi Mulin smiled. But I can't do much in my current state, right? She didn't say anything. She cleaned up the bowl and ate something simple herself. He asked her to come over. She hesitated for a moment but still went over and sat on the sofa beside the bed. Yi Mulin looked at her and said in a low voice, what do you think of my mother and Hao Yun? She widened her eyes and didn't say anything. He knew that she didn't want to say anything because they were divorced, so he smiled. They're good. People need love in life. What about you? She finally asked, are you in love with Wen Yuan? Yi Mulin's gaze was deep as he stared at her. After a long time, he smiled faintly. Bai Shuali, you already know the answer, don't you? He reached out and asked her to come over. She didn't want to go over, but she was afraid that he would get up, so she went over. He asked her to lie on the edge of his bed. His cold fingers caressed her as if she was his beloved pet, and his voice was very low. Yeah. She wanted to look up, but he didn't let her. He just pressed her down and said in a low voice, Shuali, remember what I said today, okay? She was a little dazed, not knowing if she should remember anything. Yi Mulin didn't say much. He just let go of her and made a call to Hao Yun. After that, he made a few more calls. After putting down the phone, he stared at Bai Shuali's sparkling eyes. I must protect Hao Yun. Not only for my mother, but also for myself. Bai Shuali's voice was dry. You also want to climb up. So she wanted to protect Hao Yun. Yi Mulin looked at her and didn't deny it. Yes, if I tried my best to climb up, without Hao Yun, it would probably take me twice as long. He switched to another topic. Hao Yun is more useful to me than the Wen family. He didn't expect her to understand what he meant, but Bai Shuali did. He was saying that Wen Yuan was just a stepping stone for him to climb higher. But you're being unfair to Wen Yuan, she said in a small voice. She had long forgotten that she and Wen Yuan were rivals in love. Yi Mulin smiled faintly, so what? Bai Shuali was stunned for a long time before she mustered up her courage and whispered, then, will you sleep with her? After asking the question, she felt that it was pointless, so she lowered her eyes and didn't speak. Yi Mulin let go of her, stared at her for a while, and then smiled. Then, do you want me to sleep with her? She said nothing. He changed his question. Will you be angry if I sleep with her? She looked up and saw his smiling eyes. After a long time, she shook her head. I don't know. You will be angry if you don't know. He smiled weakly. Don't worry, I can't do anything now. Chapter 35-51. After she finished speaking, Yi Mulin looked at her with a faint smile. There was a hint of amusement in his eyes. Bai Shuali felt a little helpless. She bit her lower lip. Well, I didn't mean that. Then what do you mean? Do you want me to sleep with her? He asked in a low voice. She looked straight at him and stood up stiffly. I'm going to the washroom. He held her hand. Bai Shuali looked down. He was looking at her. I don't want to answer this question, she said in a low voice. Why? There's no why. She was a little annoyed. Yi Mulin, let go of me. But he did not let go of her hand. You asked me. Bai Shuali was furious. But you didn't answer me. He looked at her, but she didn't speak. She looked back at him stubbornly. After a long time, he said, I won't. Bai Shuali was stunned. Are you satisfied? He smiled and closed his eyes. I'm going to sleep for a while. Don't go away. She looked down at him holding her hand. She was in a daze. He said in a low voice, lie with me for a while. When he used force, she naturally lay down. She wanted to refuse, but she was afraid that she would hurt him, so she had to lie down with him. The ward was very quiet. He was probably too tired and fell asleep. Bai Shuali bit her lip. After a long time, she felt that he had fallen asleep. So she leaned over and put her face on his shoulder. She gently hugged him. This little hug seemed to be stolen. Because he might be Wen Yuan's husband in the future. He said that he wouldn't sleep with Wen Yuan, but they were engaged and married. Wouldn't they sleep for the rest of their lives? That was unrealistic. Bai Shuali felt a dull pain in her heart. She told herself that she shouldn't have loved him anymore. She shouldn't have. She closed her eyes and buried her face in his. She deeply inhaled his scent. It was very warm. Wen Yuan stood at the door and looked at everything in the ward quietly. Yimubai said softly, do you still want to be engaged to him? Wen Yuan, some men love a woman for a lifetime. You know the reason. Why do you still want to continue? Wen Yuan looked down. He's the most suitable person for me. Suitable? Yimubai said in a low voice, Wen Yuan, I thought you were very smart. Wen Yuan lowered his head. After a long time, he whispered, he needs me. He needs you because of Bai Shuali. Can you see that? He's very happy with her, even when he's sick. Do you know how long it's been since he's had a good night's sleep? It's all because of her. Everything he does is for Bai Shuali. Even if Shuali doesn't know and misunderstands him, he's still the same, because of love. Wen Yuan looked at him and smiled sadly. As long as he needs me. Yimubai cursed, stupid as hell. He turned around and left. It was rare for him to lose his temper. Wen Yuan also left. At this moment, it was a world between the two of them that she could not interfere with. She still had this bit of self-awareness. After Wen Yuan and Yimubai left, Yi Mulin opened his eyes and looked quietly in the direction of the door. He lowered his head and kissed Bai Shuali, who was in his arms. He closed his eyes and rubbed her fluffy little head. His voice was hoarse and hoarse. Shuali. Bai Shuali, she had been sleeping. He was the patient, but she slept more soundly than him. Chapter 35-52. Yi Mulin immediately fell asleep with her. He was too tired and he needed to rest. Therefore, he really rested for a week in the hospital. In addition to eating, he slept. Of course, he slept with Bai Shuali. There was a rumor in the hospital that Yi Mulin had a super doting Shaoqing. Even when he was sick, he stayed in bed all day. Even his real girlfriend stood aside and didn't pay attention to him at all. Moreover, when everyone went in and out of Yi Mulin's ward, Yi Mulin was awake, while Xiao Qing was asleep. How could Yi Mulan be so tired when he was sick? The rumor spread, but the ward was like another world, warm and sweet. Yi Mulan was discharged from the hospital a week later and returned to the house of Sinan Mansion. He still had to rest for a few days, but Hao Yun came to deliver the official documents every morning and evening. Bai Shuali calculated that Yi Mulan would work more than 8 hours a day at home, so she went to deliver a plate of fruit after Hao Yun left. She put the plate in front of him and didn't leave. Yi Mulan sat behind the desk and flipped through the files. He didn't raise his head but just lowered it and asked, "What's wrong?" Bai Shuali walked to the table and pushed the plate forward. "You haven't moved for a long time." He smiled and said, "The doctor told me to move less." She stared at him and bit her lip. "That's not what he meant. Dr. Li said that you should rest these days and can't work." Yi Mulan put down the documents in his hand and sighed. "I don't do these things. No one can do them for me." She stared at him. "Then tell me, are you happy now?" She seemed to be ignited. She picked up the documents and stared at his eyes. "Tell me, are you tired of these boring things all day? Do you like reading these things? Are you tired of living?" "Surely." His voice was deep and slow. "Don't mess around. Put it down. These are official documents." "I won't put it down." She looked into his eyes stubbornly. "You weren't like this in the past. What happened to you, Yi Mulan? What happened to us?" She took a step back. "I don't understand. If you divorce me, at least one of you will have a better life. But I see you working like this every day. It's even harder than when I was serving others in those clothes. I feel like you've been raped by the so-called ambition and power. Yi Mulan, tell me, is this really the life you want?" As she spoke, tears streamed down her cheeks. However, he was still sitting there coldly and nobly, just like the Yi Mulan she knew. He slowly said, "It seems like you've been thinking a lot about me recently." She kept silent and looked at him. Yi Mulan smiled faintly. His pupils deepened and his voice trembled with a different kind of low sexiness. "Whether I don't like it or don't want it, I have to accept it. Bai Shuali, if you want to ask me if I'm happy." He stood up slowly and walked to her side. He paused for a moment and put his hands on her shoulders. He smiled and said, "I'll be happier when you're by my side." Bai Shuali looked up. She looked a little nervous. She didn't understand what he said, but she understood what he said. He was happy when she was by his side. Her throat tightened. She said softly, "Yi Mulan, we can't go back." Chapter 35-53. She bit her lip and wanted to leave, but Yi Mulan caught her hand. She turned to look at him. "What are you doing?" He smiled. "Didn't you complain that I always work and don't accompany you?" Her eyes widened and she took a step back, but he pulled her again. She couldn't leave and could only be dragged into his arms. "I didn't." The tip of his nose moved forward and easily touched hers. His masculine scent also enveloped her body, leaving her with nowhere to escape. His palm was flat on the back of her waist, and he pulled her closer. His voice was huskier. "That's what it means to a man." "I really didn't." She probably felt some subtle changes in his body. She felt a little dangerous and wanted to escape, but Yi Mulan didn't let her. He hugged her, his voice husky against the side of her neck. "Did you miss me, huh?" She bit her lip. "No." He kissed the back of her ear, and his thin lips moved to the corner of her mouth. "But I missed you." With that, he kissed her. She didn't want to. She was afraid that his wound would burst, so she put her hands on his shoulders and said, "Don't, it'll burst." He kissed her for a while, and she retreated until she was against the sofa. He covered her and bit her chin. "I'll explode if you keep holding on." He pulled her hand, but she didn't want to. He chuckled and kissed her, trying to seduce her. However, no matter how he seduced her, she refused. Her eyes were watery, and she almost cried and begged him, "No, you'll get hurt." He was still teasing her. "You'll feel bad if I get hurt, right?" She bit her lip and couldn't say anything for a long time. She closed her eyes and looked very pitiful. Yi Mulin still got what he wanted. She was very nervous and couldn't let go. He kissed her. "When will you end like this, huh?" She closed her eyes and her voice was broken. "Yi Mulin, let go." "No, no." He chuckled. "I can't." He picked her up and let her sit in his arms. She was very embarrassed, and she looked a little lost and pitiful. He kissed her and whispered in her ear, "Baishuali, don't hurt me." Her mind was in a mess with an indescribable feeling. Then she stared at him blankly. Yi Mulin did nothing but kiss her and let her hair down. Her black hair fell smoothly on her neck, making her look especially charming and beautiful. She parted her lips and said hoarsely, "Yi Mulin." His dark eyes were like a deep pool of water, so deep that she could not see the bottom. She was immersed in it and could not escape. Suddenly, she burst into tears. She laid on his shoulder and punched him with her fists. Her body twitched as she cried, "Yi Mulin, you bastard." She was indignant, she was angry, and she hated him, but she still loved him. Love, also hate. Yi Mulin exhaled with difficulty. He reached out and pressed her down, murmuring softly, "Don't cry." What should I do if you cry like this?" He didn't want to tell her that if she cried like this, it would only make the man want to bully her even more. He couldn't bear it anymore. He hugged her and whispered in her ear, "You do it, or should I do it?" She was at a loss. "I might get hurt." He smiled. He gave her a choice. It seemed to be very democratic, but in fact, it was very despicable. Chapter 35-54. When it was over, she lay on his shoulder and refused to get up. Her whole body was soft and she was crying softly. She cried so much that he wanted to do it again. Yi Mulin closed his eyes and went through all the documents that he had read today. Only then did he suppress the thoughts that he shouldn't have. He lowered his head and looked at her soft face. He coaxed her softly. "What's wrong?" Her arms wrapped around his neck. She hugged him and refused to make a sound. However, her body was still trembling. Shweli, he took off her body and held her face. "Are you feeling unwell?" Her lips were trembling. She couldn't say a word. Yi Mulin roughly understood what she was thinking. He hugged her with one hand and used the other to tidy up the tissues for her. She half closed her eyes and rested her head on his shoulder. She said, "Yi Mulin, we will go to hell." She had once asked him if he would abandon the Yi family for her since she had abandoned the Bai family. He said he wouldn't. But now, she has completely abandoned the Bai clan. She has abandoned her clan. She has fallen into eternal damnation. Yi Mulin lowered his head and found her lips. He kissed her forcefully. After kissing for a long time, he let go of her and murmured beside her lips, "When we are together, hell is also heaven." She opened her eyes and looked at him helplessly. He said not to be afraid. He would always be by her side. She cried and suddenly hugged his neck. She kept saying that this wasn't right and that they shouldn't be together. He hugged her and said slowly and firmly, "We will always be together." Later, she fell asleep. He guarded her and covered her with a blanket. He slept on the sofa. He went to read the documents again. He sat at his desk and spaced out for a while. Bai Shueli asked him if he was happy and if he liked her. He didn't tell her that if the price of being with her was not happiness, he would choose to be like this forever. Picking up the document, he read it bit by bit until he received a call. It was from Secretary Li, sounding panicked. Boss Yi, someone from B City has taken Secretary Hao away. They're on their way to the airport now. Yi Mulin held his phone and was silent for a while. Of course, he knew that this was the result of his father's consideration after returning to B City for a week. In the end, he couldn't stand his mother's empathy and couldn't accept the fact that Su Fu liked another man. Yi Mulin didn't know how far their relationship had progressed, but he knew that it must be something serious for his father to be this angry. He gripped his phone tightly and said calmly, "Don't tell anyone about this. I'll go to the airport immediately." Secretary Li said worriedly, "But your health?" Yi Mulin's voice was a little bitter. "I'm fine." He hung up the phone and stood up. When he passed by Bai Shueli, he paused. After a moment of silence, he bent over and kissed her. His voice was a little low. "People who love each other should stay together, right?" He took his coat and walked out of the villa. When he walked out of the villa, his face was cold, as if the intense love half an hour ago was just an illusion. He drove his own car at 150 kilometers per hour. When he arrived at the airport, he happened to intercept the people from B City. Yi Mulin knew all four of them. They were people that Yi Xinggang often ordered around. Yi Mulin's arrival made the few of them feel a little helpless. However, they still braced themselves and went forward. "Young master, why are you here? Old Yi is worried about your health." Chapter 35-55. When Yi Mulin said that, the four of them looked as if they had eaten shit. If anything happened to young master, they wouldn't be able to bear the responsibility. If they didn't handle this well, they would also die. Just as the four of them were hesitating, Hao Yun said, "Mulin, let me go back. Nothing will happen." Yi Mulin took a step forward and glanced at the few men. Then, he said casually, "I want to speak to Secretary General Hao alone." "Step back." Hao Yun stared at him. Yi Mulin, on the other hand, looked at those people and shouted in a low voice, "Get lost." The few of them touched their noses and could only leave. Yi Mulin then turned to look at Hao Yun. He paused for a long time before saying, "I know you have something on my father and you will use it to threaten him. But Uncle Hao, I know you too well. You should know my father well too. He will always have a heart of stone but you can't." Hao Yun's expression changed. Yi Mulin smiled bitterly. He can even be cruel to himself, let alone others. So, if you can't bear to be cruel, don't use this to threaten him. Otherwise, it won't be a lose-lose situation. In the end, you will be the one who gets hurt. My mother and I might live in pain for the rest of her life. Hao Yun's voice was a little pained. "Mulin, I'll go back to B City with you." Yi Mulin said firmly, "Also, I'm not doing this just for you. My mother isn't young anymore. Are you going to make her wait?" After Yi Mulin said that, Hao Yun looked at him suspiciously. "Mulin, are you going to sacrifice yourself in exchange? Everything is temporary." Yi Mulin's voice was firm. Then, he boarded the plane. "Let's go. I have to come back tomorrow morning. Shueli is at home and you have to come back with me. I can't leave you here." Hao Yun was speechless and didn't know what to say. That night, Yi Mulin flew to B City. When Bai Shueli woke up, he wasn't there. There were documents in the study that he had flipped open. It was late at night and she was a little lost. She walked over and sat beside his desk. There was a white piece of paper with a line of words written on it. Return to B City tomorrow morning. It was signed by Yi Mulin. She stared at it blankly, then tore off the page and gently folded it into the shape of an airplane. Opening the window, the cold night wind blew in her face. She threw the plane into the darkness, and the small piece of white paper flew out until she could no longer see it. B City's night house was like a storm. Yi Xingang met his adulterer, Hao Yun, and also met his good son. He was really a good son of Su Fu. He had just been discharged from the hospital for a few days, and he had returned to B City with injuries. He wanted to clear the name of his mother and his mother's adulterer. He was not young anymore, but he still found himself a stepfather. Wasn't he ashamed? Yi Xingang ignored Hao Yun and directly brought Yi Mulin into the study. When Yi Mulin entered the study room, Chi-Chi found that the things in the study room had been smashed to the ground. It was obvious that his mother had provoked his father quite a bit. As soon as Yi Mulin entered, he hooked his lips and dropped another heavy bomb. Xia Anning, I've dealt with it. Yi Xingang was already angry. His hands were on his waist. At this moment, his eyes almost popped out because of anger. He immediately went forward and grabbed Yi Mulin's collar. His hoarse voice was furious. What did you say? Xia Anning has been dealt with. Not in jail, but dealt with. She died in an accident. Yi Mulin's voice was calm. His expression was as simple as killing a chick. An accident. She personally went to command and died on the spot. She will be given the honor after her death. This is the best result, isn't it? Yi Xinggang's hands were still holding his son's collar tightly. He also saw that there were some bruises on his son's neck. He sneered. It seemed that he had recovered very well. He forcefully let go and glared at Yi Mulin. Why did you do this? His voice was almost a low roar. Chapter 35-56. Yi Xinggang's face darkened. But Xia Anning shouldn't have done this. Yes, she shouldn't have done this. Yi Mulin's eyes darkened. But she suffered because of you. Because I can't do anything to you, I can only wrong her. Yi Xinggang's face changed completely. He stared at his son. Mulin, in your heart, what is the relationship between us? Yi Mulin smiled bitterly. Father, you should know the answer better than me, right? Yi Xingang was forced to retreat again and again in the face of such a gaze and words, and he felt an unconcealable sense of disappointment. He said dejectedly, why are you making things difficult for her? It's me who let your mother down. It's fine as long as you say that. Yi Mulin said calmly, I must take Uncle Hao away unless you want to see the Yi family destroyed. Yi Xingang stared at his son and got angry again. What do you want to do, Mulin? Are you crazy? Yi Mulin took out a stack of documents and threw it on the table. He said calmly, if I exchange the future of the Yi family for my mother's marriage, you're the one who wins. Yi Xinggang's eyes fell on the stack of documents. He was so angry that his whole body was trembling. Then he looked at the son he was so proud of and slapped him. This was the second time he slapped his son. The first time was for Bai Shuali and the second time was for Su Fu. This son of his was always going against his father for the sake of a woman. This was really infuriating. Yi Xingang was angry. After slapping him, Yi Mulin was still unmoved. He looked at his father and said resolutely, if the Yi family is destroyed, I can take Shuali and mother abroad. But you have nothing. Do you hate me that much? Yi Xinggang's voice was harsh. Just for Bai Shuali. I'll kill Bai Shuali in prison right now. Then you have no way out. You can do that. You don't have to worry about me. A storm was brewing on Yi Mulin's face. Dad, there's nothing I can't sacrifice. But if you dare to move, I'll make you regret it for the first time in decades. Yi Mulin's finger lightly tapped on the document. He paused for a moment and said in an extremely indifferent tone, "We all live within these rules. Regardless of whether it's the person who made the rules or others, we all have to abide by them. You are no exception." As he spoke, he turned around and walked out. The wound on his lower abdomen hurt faintly, but he didn't feel dispirited at all and walked straight out. He could not fall. Right now, he was the only one who could fight against his father, Yi Xinggang. He walked towards his mother's bedroom. When Su Fu saw him, he was shocked. "Mulin." Yi Mulin's expression became gentle. "Mom, come back to H City with me in the future." There were tears in Su Fu's eyes. "Mulin, you don't blame me. What's there to blame for pursuing one's own happiness?" He walked over and gently caressed his mother's hair. He said gently, "Can we start over? There will be no Xia and Ning in the future." Su Fu's lips trembled. She looked at her son in disbelief. In the past, Mulin wouldn't do this. He was a lawyer. Using violence to fight violence was not his style, but now he was. Chapter 35-57. Therefore, he didn't care about using Wen Yuan. He didn't care that Wen Yuan would be worse in the future. He only knew that Shirley and his mother were the people he had to protect. Nothing else mattered. He protected his weak mother and went downstairs. He only put a coat on her and didn't take anything else. Oh, she also brought a small box, which was full of books and gifts from Hao Yun. As for Yi Xinggang's things, she didn't take anything with her. The decades of love between husband and wife were gone. It made people sigh. Downstairs, Yi Xinggang watched Su Fu being carried downstairs by Yi Mulin. His face was ashen and his voice was trembling. "Su Fu, are you really leaving?" At this time, the bodyguards had left. There was only a few of them. There was nothing that couldn't be said. Su Fu looked at him and Hao Yun beside him. Yi Xinggang's voice was heavy. "We have been husband and wife for so many years. Don't you give me any chance? Is it really not as good as the 1 year you have with him? Su Fu, let's forget about the past and start over, okay?" Su Fu's expression was a little blank. She shook her head gently. "You are too heartless, Yi Xinggang. You are really too heartless." Yi Xinggang looked at her eyes, which were bloodshot. He chuckled. "Am I heartless? Su Fu, you are not heartless. You are going to leave me for an insignificant man. What can he give you? He is just a small secretary general. He can never climb as high as me. He can never give you a noble identity. He can't let you become the glorious Madame Yi. Are you used to that kind of life? Or did he overestimate himself and pursue you? He wants to get the property under your name. Have you ever thought that you don't want to become a brainless Su Fu after living a comfortable life all your life?" He finished speaking in one breath. Su Fu smiled faintly. "Glory. I was very glorious in the past, but I've also tasted the most embarrassing feeling. Yi Xinggang, these are all given to me by you, whether good or bad." After Su Fu finished speaking, she looked exhausted. She lowered her head and whispered, "I won't love you anymore." "Xinggang, you actually understand me, don't you?" Yi Xinggang looked at her and smiled sadly. He understood her. She was a woman who needed to be loved with all her heart. She was not clingy, she was elegant like an orchid, but she needed love to support her. She was also tenacious. Once she realized that his love was no longer there, she would immediately leave him without hesitation. She was Su Fu, the naturally arrogant Su Fu, who had the capital, and was completely different from a woman like Xia Ning. She did not care about Mrs. Ye's reputation. Yes, after leaving him, Yi Zhengang, she was rich and beautiful, and there were still many men who wanted her, even if they were younger than her. Yi Zhengang closed his eyes. Then what about after that? You and Hao Yun will be together. Can he afford to raise you? I don't need anyone to support me. Su Fu whispered, then looked at his son. Let's go. She walked down the stairs step by step. When she passed by Yi Zhengang, he immediately grabbed her arm and said with a deep and painful voice, Su Fu. Su Fu paused for a moment, then lowered his eyes. Let go, Yi Zhengang, we have reached the end. Without Xia Ning or Hao Yun, we will not be able to reach the end. She looked at him with a hint of sorrow on her face. The person I loved in the past no longer exists. Chapter 35-58. After a long time, he finally said, I can change it. These words were very humble. Su Fu gently shook her head. You can't go back. Yi Zhenggang's face was ashen as his fingers grabbed her tightly. In the past, when he had sex with Xia Anning for the first time, he was so high-spirited. At that time, he didn't think that his Su Fu was waiting for him at home. If there was a first time, there would be a second time, countless times. If he didn't think that way, if he could treat Su Fu like he did in the past, would she not leave him? There were too many ifs in Yi Zhenggang's heart, but he knew that there were no ifs with his Su Fu. What happened was what happened, and he wouldn't forgive her. In the future, she wouldn't be his Su Fu, but Hao Yun's. Thinking of this, he smiled bitterly. His fingers loosened, and Su Fu walked away from his fingertips. Yi Zhengang looked at his fingers and was confused for a while. After a long time, he came back to his senses. At that time, Su Fu was already standing beside Hao Yun, and the way she looked at Hao Yun broke his heart. His wife, who once belonged to him, fell in love with someone else. Yi Zhenggang's voice was sorrowful. If I don't let you go, none of you can leave. Yi Mulin slowly walked down and looked at Yi Zhengang. I will do as you say, but I have to take my mother away. Yi Zhengang held his breath. You mean when Yuan? Yi Mulin didn't say anything. Yi Zhengang smiled, and his smile was extremely miserable. After a long time, he called out to her, Su Fu, I still have a few words to say to you. He turned around and walked into the study. Su Fu looked at his back and followed him. Hao Yun held her hand, and she patted him. It's okay, don't worry. She slowly walked into the study and closed the door. Yi Zhengang stood by the bookshelf, took out an exquisite crystal music box, and opened it. Very beautiful Turkish music came from it. After listening for a while, he looked at her. It's for you. I brought it back from my business trip. I thought you would like it. Su Fu did not make a sound, nor did he reach out to take it. Yi Zhengang smiled miserably again. Do you only like the gifts from Hao Yun now? She said softly, we don't need to get involved anymore. Yi Zhengang was silent for a while, and then smiled faintly. I just wanted to see if you would be moved. It seems that I won't. He raised his hand and placed it on the cabinet door. His fingers paused for a long time before he opened the cabinet door as if he had made up his mind. He took out a document and gently placed it on the table. It was a divorce settlement. Su Fu was a little surprised. Yi Zhengang muttered, Su Fu, I thought that we would be able to reach the end of our lives. I've let you down, and I deserve it. The things you want are here. After signing this, you can leave. I'll send them to you, or I'll have Mulin bring them to you. When he said these words, his tone was very flat, as if there was no fluctuation, but his voice was very deep. Su Fu reached out to take it, looked at it, and then signed it. There was no division of property in this agreement, because there was nothing to divide between the two parties, the only thing was feelings. At this time, Yi Xinggang knew that Su Fu never needed his things. She had her own wealth, but she didn't need power. When she was Madame Yi, she liked to do flowers and take care of the children at home. Chapter 35-59. Yi Xinggang pursed his lips and said in a low voice, "If Hao Yun bullies you, come back and tell me. I'll help you fix him up. Also, don't agree to him too quickly. Men still have to be tested." He was like an old friend, but also like a worried parent. He had once thought that Su Fu was old, but at this moment, he felt that Su Fu was well protected. She was the one who was very young. No matter if it was him or Xia Anning, they were actually very old in their hearts. "I know." Su Fu looked up at him. "Thank you, Xinggang." He stared at her, his old eyes filled with reluctance. After a long time, he went over and hugged her. He said, "Su Fu, I'm sorry. If we do it again, I'll treat you very well," but there was no next time. His Su Fu still left. With Hao Yun, he left Beast City that night. Yi Xinggang went to their former bedroom. She did not take anything with her, clothes, shoes, or jewelry. She did not want anything from Madame Yi, and she did not want it either. He sat on the bed and looked at everything around him, then closed his eyes. But when he closed his eyes, his mind was filled with the once young and lively Su Fu, who was leaning on the sofa with a book in his hand, waiting for him at the same time. It was also the first time he had sex with Su Fu. Although he was drunk, he woke up after that, and when he saw Su Fu waiting for him under the dim yellow light, he felt guilty. That night, Su Fu did not know what he had read in the book, but he was especially gentle. After taking care of him and lying on the bed, she hugged him. He did not give it to her for the first time, because he had already had it with other women, and he was powerless. He remembered that Su Fu's expression that night was a little mischievous. She said that he was old and that he was Uncle Yi. "Su Fu, your Uncle Yi betrayed you that night." Yi Xinggang laid on the bed. The light was dazzling. He reached out to cover his eyes, and then, tears flowed down from the corner of his eyes. Su Fu, no longer. H City. Early in the morning, Secretary Li was waiting anxiously at the airport. When the plane finally landed, she immediately went up to him and asked, "Boss Yi, are you all right?" Yi Mulin nodded lightly, "I'm fine." "Have you done what I asked you to do?" Secretary Li nodded. "Well, I've rented an apartment in Sinan Mansion. It's 120 square meters. It's enough for Madam." Because Yi Mulin would return to Beast City sooner or later, they didn't have any property in H City. Yi Mulin nodded and looked at his mother. "Uncle Hao used to live in the office, but it's not convenient now. Shirley also lives in Sinan residence. You can go and chat with her when you're bored, but don't do her laundry. Don't spoil her." Su Fu thought it was inappropriate. "I'll stay with you." Hao Yun did not utter a word. He was quite patient. Yi Mulin smiled. "Shuai Li's temper isn't very good right now. It's more convenient for us to live separately." Su Fu was speechless. Was this still the self-disciplined son? At this moment, Yi Mulin looked at Secretary Li. "Get the driver to send Hao Mijang and my mother to the apartment. You take them there, and I'll drive back myself." Secretary Li was worried. "Your body, it's fine." He said lightly, "I'll be fine after a nap." Chapter 35-60. Secretary Li didn't say anything and asked the driver to drive to Sinan Mansion. The car drove far away. She saw Yi Mulan's car still parked there in the rearview mirror. After a long time, Secretary Li finally withdrew her gaze and didn't say anything. Su Fu and Hao Yun, who were sitting in the back seat, didn't say anything either. The relationship between them was a little uncomfortable. After more than an hour, the black limousine stopped downstairs in an apartment in Sinan Mansion. The apartment rented by Secretary Li was about 5 minutes away from Yi Mulan and by Shuli's apartment. It was neither too far nor too close. The car door opened. Secretary Li helped Su Fu to go upstairs, and Hao Yun followed them. Secretary Li knew what to do. He stopped when he saw Su Fu off. He handed the keys to Su Fu and said, "I'll pay for the water and electricity here. There's nothing else. I still have to go to work." After she finished speaking, she looked at her boss, Hao Yun. Hao Yun coughed softly. "Thank you. Secretary Hao, remember to raise my salary." Secretary Li said a little playfully. Then she said goodbye and left. As soon as she left, the house suddenly became empty. It was too quiet. Su Fu looked at Hao Yun and licked her lower lip. "Let me have a look here." Hao Yun nodded. "I will go to the kitchen to make a bowl of noodles for you." Su Fu was taken aback for a moment before he smiled. "All right." She turned around and walked into the living room. Hao Yun suddenly stopped her. "Su Fu, are you sure you want to be with me? I may quit this circle in a few years. Tsinghua University has been inviting me to teach. I may be a poor teacher in the future." Su Fu looked at him and smiled. "Can you ask him if there is a lack of a Chinese teacher there?" This time, it was Hao Yun who was stunned. Su Fu walked over and gently touched his arm. "Didn't you say to go downstairs?" "Hao Yun, I am hungry." He looked down at her, and it was as if he was looking at the younger Su Fu again. He gently patted the back of her hand and turned to the kitchen. Secretary Li was indeed thoughtful. Not only did she rent the apartment, but she also filled the kitchen utensils and even the fridge. Hao Yun took the ingredients and made tomato and egg noodles. On the other side, Su Fu briefly looked around. The place was not very big, but the decoration was very exquisite, which was also her favorite style. After she finished looking around, she walked back to the kitchen. Hao Yun was putting noodles into 2 bowls. She gently hugged him from behind and said in a low voice, "Hao Yun, it's good here." Hao Yun felt her face against his back. He could feel her orchid scent through the thick coat. His heart and body were a little restless, but he held it back. He didn't want her to think that he was an impatient man when they just got together. Although he longed. Hao Yun turned around. "It's good that you like it." He brought the noodles to the dining table and helped her sit down. He said softly, "Each city might stay for another year or 2 before Mulin is transferred back to B City. At that time, the struggle would be the most serious, and now, it was just the beginning." As an insider and an outsider, Hao Yun could clearly see that Mulin did not like Zi's governance, but people had to think for themselves. Through Xia Anning's matter, Hao Yun had already seen Yi Mulin's change. In the past, Yi Mulin would not have made a move, but now, he was really ruthless. Chapter 3561. Hao Yun knew what she meant, so he put his hand on the back of her hand. "He's not doing it for us. He's just doing it for the big picture. You'll know in the future. He'll be with Shirley." Su Fu looked down. "I'm not interested in that, but it's not like I don't understand it at all. I know that Mulin wants to replace or even surpass his father's position, but can surely understand how many years it will take. Can she wait? I'm really afraid that she won't understand Mulin. Hao Yun smiled. I've waited for so many years, haven't I? Su Fu didn't know what to say. She whispered, let's eat the noodles. It's getting cold. Hao Yun had been single for a long time, so his cooking skills were very good. Su Fu felt very warm when she ate. After eating, she wanted to wash the dishes, but Hao Yun didn't let her. He said that he couldn't guarantee a rich life, but he couldn't guarantee that she could do the housework. Tomorrow, he would find a housekeeper to come over. When he was washing the dishes, Su Fu leaned against him and whispered, I used to do this. I also washed clothes. When Shirley just got married, I washed clothes for her. Hao Yun turned his head in surprise. Really? She nodded. Yes, I'll wash for you in the future. But can you not find anyone else to come over? I don't like other people at home. If I'm really bored, I can talk to Shirley. Hao Yun's hands stopped moving. She looked at him. What's wrong with you? Hao Yun smiled bitterly. Su Fu, I can't help it if you lean on me like this. You go wash and sleep first. I'll smoke. Are you going to work later? Su Fu stared at him and asked. He thought for a moment, but still shook his head. Not today. Her expression seemed to have relaxed. Then, she gently hugged his waist and said in a very low voice, he and I have officially agreed on a divorce. You, actually don't have to endure it. Hao Yun's body was very stiff. He stood there for a long time and couldn't say a word. After a long time, he looked down at her and said in a hoarse voice, Su Fu, I've never had a woman before. I might not do well. Su Fu buried her face in his shoulder and said softly, will you be disappointed in me? I've given birth to 2 children. Hao Yun, I'm not perfect anymore. I might not be the Su Fu in your heart. She was on the verge of menopause. She couldn't give him that kind of perfect experience. He should find a young girl. Thinking of this, Su Fu wanted to escape. Hao Yun caught her and trapped her in her arms. She gently lifted her up and carried her all the way to the bed in the bedroom. He lay with her, not in a hurry to possess her. He looked down at her and gently kissed her cheeks and her chin. The lines of her face were very good. She didn't look like a person in her 50s at all. He kissed her like that for a long time before saying in a hoarse voice, in my heart, you will always be that Su Fu. The first time was always a bit messy. Fortunately, there was always someone who would understand. As their hair intertwined, they completed their first time. After it was over, Hao Yun hugged her tightly and kissed her hair. He whispered, Su Fu, you make me intoxicated. He never knew that this kind of thing was so wonderful. Her body was well maintained, and she was like a woman in her 30s. He was a little addicted. Chapter 3562. Ever since Su Fu got together with him, she had let her hair down and no longer tied it up, unless it was an important event. That was because Hao Yun said that he liked the way she let her hair down, and so she did that. However, she did not know that Hao Yun liked the way she let her hair down on the bed the most. Her black hair was spread on the pillow, and it was beautiful. That day, Hao Yun did not go to work and had been accompanying Su Fu the entire time. Later on, Su Fu could not take it anymore and urged him to go to work. He just smiled and pulled her into his arms. Let's rest then. I'll cook for you later. She replied softly, and he said worriedly, Su Fu and I might not have so many banquets to attend, and it might just be the daily necessities of an ordinary person. Of course, I know that you have the ability to live a better life, and I don't object to that. I'm not such a narrow-minded man, but I can really only give you the life of an ordinary person. Can you get used to it? Su Fu said faintly, what should I do? We've already slept together. Hao Yun pondered for a long time before he understood what she meant. He pinched her face. Say it again. Su Fu slapped his hand away. Sleeping together doesn't mean that you can bully me. For a moment, Hao Yun did not know what to say. Su Fu came over and hugged him. She placed her head on his shoulder gently and smiled. This is just right. Hao Yun, you're just right too. She smiled faintly, like a spring breeze blowing across 10 miles. What she wanted was never power, but a man who understood her. After leaving Yizhanggang, what she pursued was still the same as 30 years ago, and she would not lower her requirements. Hao Yun was what she wanted, and she would never compromise. She only got together with him because she liked him, and nothing else. Hao Yun was stunned. She raised her head and kissed him, closing her eyes. I'm a little tired, Hao Yun. Can you let me rest for a while? Hao Yun's throat was a little hoarse as he said, okay. She fell asleep in his arms. He coaxed her, but she couldn't fall asleep immediately. He thought of a lot of things in the past. He thought of the time when he was studying at Tsinghua University. If he could start all over again, would he have the courage to confess to her? Would he have been the only one who could get her? Hao Yun smiled. It was a smile of relief. Just like what she said, Hao Yun was very good, just right, and the current Su Fu was also very good. He was not less than before, and he was just as attractive as before, making him want to cherish him. In another villa of Sinan Mansion, in the morning, Yi Mulan's car was parked downstairs for about half an hour. He smoked a few cigarettes to disperse the hostility on his body, and then opened the door to get off. He pushed open the door of the villa. Bai Shuali was sitting there, looking at him quietly. She was still wearing her pajamas. He was dumbfounded. Why are you sitting here? The heater isn't on. He walked over and picked her up. She struggled for a while. You've just recovered. I can walk by myself. But he seemed not to hear it. He held her straight and walked upstairs. After holding her in the quilt, he whispered, You can't take care of yourself without me, huh? She stared at him. Are you tired? Chapter 35-63. Bai Shuali was hugged by him for a long time before she came back to her senses. She bit her lip and suddenly pressed him against the headboard, her little hands unbuttoning his shirt. Yi Mulan misunderstood and lowered his head. You want me, don't you? Her little hands were still busy until she looked at his wound. After looking at it for a while, she quietly buttoned it for him and said softly, I'm worried about you, I don't dare to sleep. He then realized that he was thinking too much and said hoarsely, You've been waiting for me. She nodded. Are you back in B City? Is it tiring to rush here and there? Yeah, I'm very tired. I'll sleep for a while. He pulled her to lie down with him. He said that he was tired but he couldn't fall asleep immediately after lying down. He said softly, I brought my mom back. Bai Shuali looked at him. Where is she? He looked at her. She's with Uncle Hao. They will be together in the future. She was a little shocked and couldn't digest it for a while. Were they really together just like that? She asked him softly, How did your dad agree? Yi Mulan lowered his head to look at her and didn't answer her question. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. After a long time, he pulled her into his arms and rested his chin on her hair. He said softly, Bai Shuali, stay by my side. Don't think about running away or I won't let you go, do you hear me? She raised her head to look at him but he didn't let her. He pressed down on her little head. Bai Shuali bit her lower lip, lowered her head and didn't say anything. She just stayed in his arms obediently. He was cold at first but then he warmed up. He said, Bai Shuali, I don't want you to see me like this. But let me tell you, I will never become another Yi Jinggang and you will never become Su Fu. Do you understand what I mean? She thought about it for a long time but still didn't understand what he meant. She said directly, I don't know. He seemed a little angry and then didn't say anything. She said, oh, and looked at him. Yi Mulin closed his eyes and said fiercely, sometimes, I really want to strangle you. So do you want to go to jail or not? She said softly. He opened his eyes and glared at her. Her voice became even softer. I'm doing this for your own good. For the first time, he kissed her lips and whispered, shut up. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'll strangle you to death. After being kissed by him for a long time, she finally pushed him away and anxiously said, I know, I know. When he looked at her, there was always a hint of anticipation. She said, I know what you mean. You're saying, we won't divorce, right? He looked at her reservedly and said nothing. Bai Shuali bit her lip and said, but we're already divorced and you have one yuan. Yi Mulin's face darkened and he sneered, Bai Shuali, your understanding is really high and mighty. He turned around and ignored her. He seemed to be angry. She stared at his back for a long time. First, she lay flat and sulked. What she said was the truth. In fact, the conflict between them was even more than that between Yi Jinggang and Su Fu. Did he think that it would disappear just because he said a few words? When Yuan wouldn't disappear either. She wasn't wrong. But he didn't say anything for a long time. She was still worried and her heart softened. She leaned over and hugged his back. Are you really angry? Chapter 35-64. Yi Mulin ignored her for a long time. She got a little anxious and climbed over him to the other side, hugging him from the front. This time, she didn't say anything and just hugged him. He would only get angry if she talked anyway. She hugged him like a rascal. After a long time, Yi Mulin looked down at her and said in a low voice, Bai Shuali, if it's possible, I won't divorce you. I won't let you cry. After he said that, he felt a little depressed and didn't say anything else. Bai Shuali hugged his arm tighter. Silently, she pressed her face against his chest and felt the warmth there. His heartbeat was very steady, which made her feel at ease. She slowly fell asleep. In a daze, she asked him, Yi Mulin, we're not going to be apart anymore, right? He wasn't asleep. Hearing that, his body trembled and then he looked down at her. After looking for a long time, he smiled lightly. Yeah, we're not going to be apart anymore. She wrapped her arms around his neck and rubbed herself against his chest. In the afternoon, when Bai Shuali woke up, he was no longer in bed. She sat on the bed in a daze for a long time before she lifted the blanket and ran out barefoot. She ran downstairs but didn't find him, so she ran to the study. Yi Mulin was there, and so was Hao Yun. The two of them looked like they were discussing something. Bai Shuali stood at the door and wanted to leave, but Yi Mulin had already found her. So did Hao Yun. He smiled. Then I'll leave first. Wait a minute, I still have something to discuss later. Yi Mulin said as he got up and walked out of the door. He looked at Bai Shuali and looked down at her toes for a while. Go back to the room and put on your shoes. Oh. She wanted to run away as soon as possible. Yi Mulin suddenly reached out and grabbed her arm. He said softly, I won't disappear suddenly. She said, oh, again. This time, Her eyes lingered on him for a long time. When she left, she was a little panicked. Yi Mulin smiled behind her. He smiled happily. She ran away barefoot, as fast as she could. Yi Mulin looked at her with a faint smile on his lips. When he walked back, Hao Yun smiled. She listens to you. Yi Mulin went back and sat down. I used to listen to it, but now. He lit a cigarette. You're not very obedient, and you hate me to death. Hao Yun laughed but didn't say anything. In fact, whether he hated or not, he could see it with a glance. They continued their discussion and dispersed at noon. Hao Yun invited Yi Mulin and Bai Shuali to his place for lunch. Yi Mulin politely declined. My wound still hurts a little. You should rest at home. Hao Yun thought about it for a while and then left. After he left, Yi Mulin walked into the bedroom. Bai Shuali had already changed her clothes and shoes and was looking at him. He smiled. What are we having for lunch? She looked at him and whispered, Can your body take it? You were discharged not long ago. Yi Mulin said in a low voice, I'm all right. Then, he rubbed her hair. Let's go downstairs for lunch. She nodded and went downstairs to eat with him. She would look at him from time to time while eating. Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled. What are you looking at? She bit her lip. Well, isn't your mother coming over? I want to see her. Yi Mulin continued eating and looked at her with a smile. It's not convenient. Chapter 35-65. Yi Mulin ate for a long time before saying, Don't you feel awkward that she's with Hao Yun now? If you don't mind, why should I? She stared at him and said softly, Yi Mulin, you really don't mind? I heard that a lot of straight men mind it. He stared at her and smiled faintly. I only mind if my wife sleeps with someone else. Her face reddened, but she didn't say anything and continued to eat. Yi Mulin suddenly said, Oh right, you used to call her mummy, but now it's your mummy. She heard his words and looked up at him before biting her lip and saying softly, We're not in that kind of relationship anymore. Then what's our relationship now? He stared at her with a burning gaze. Bai Shuali looked at him. I don't know. He chuckled. Bai Shuali, you know very well in your heart, don't you? She bit her lip and didn't say anything. He didn't mind and didn't make things difficult for her. Bai Shuali realized that Yi Mulin seemed to have changed into a different person. He had become quite tolerant and wasn't as angry as before. She didn't know if she was happy or unhappy about such a change. After eating in silence, she looked at him. I want to go for a walk. Do you want to come? She actually wanted to take him out for a walk because other than eating and sleeping, he was always working in the study and smoking. She felt that it was a little inappropriate. Her eyes were filled with anticipation as she stared at him, looking a little adorable. This reminded Yi Mulin of the time when they moved into the condominium not long after they got married. She was also adorable like this, but he had angered her to death the next day. So how could he reject her small request? He reached out and held her hand as they walked outside. The sun is pretty good. I want to go out for a walk too. Bai Shuali followed beside him and looked down at his hand that was holding hers. She felt a little guilty. They shouldn't have been together. The Bai family, the Yi family, and Wen Yuan really shouldn't have been together. But she fell in love again. She didn't want to let go of him. Yi Mulin put on a jacket. After they went out, they walked around the neighborhood. The environment here was especially good. Although it was winter, there were many green plants and even flowers. At first, he held Bai Shuali's hand. Later, she simply supported him and walked away. Yi Mulin smiled. Bai Shuali, don't treat me like a patient. I'm fine now. Didn't we do it yesterday? Her face turned red and she whispered, Yi Mulin, can you not say this? He looked down at her, his eyes gentle. Soon after, Bai Shuali discovered something to her horror. Yi Mulin had been an official for more than a year, and his entire temperament seemed to have changed. It wasn't that he was greasy, but rather that he used to be an elite cold-faced lawyer. Now, he seemed to be easygoing and had a special feeling of a superior. She kept looking at him. Yi Mulin chuckled. What's wrong? I just feel like you're different. You're like those people on the news, like my dad and your dad, she said, looking at him without blinking, as if she was studying him. Yi Mulin frowned. Are you saying that I'm old? Chapter 35-66. As soon as he said that, she glared at him. You're different from them. You're especially shameless. Yi Mulin looked around and then hugged her. His voice was particularly hoarse. Then should I be shameless right now? With that, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was on the side of the neighborhood. Under the French plane tree, something that looked like cotton floated down. Strand by strand, it landed on her hair and his shoulder. Coupled with this kiss, it was very romantic. After the kiss, he pecked the corner of her mouth and murmured, How does it feel? Bai Shuali opened her eyes wide and looked up at him. After a long while, she whispered, It's just a little sinful. His eyes dimmed for a moment, and then he quietly hugged her in his arms. His voice was low as he said, Surely, I can't do anything to the past, but I promise that it won't get any worse. He paused and lowered his voice even more. Although I think this promise is terrible, Shuali, this is the biggest promise I can make to you right now. Her lips trembled, but she didn't say anything because she didn't know what to say. After a long while, she whispered, Really, Yi Mulin, I feel very guilty. My dad is in prison, and my mom is in the hospital. I don't dare to think about what they will think and do when my dad is released one day and my mom wakes up from the hospital. If they find out that I'm still with you, will they hate me? But I can't care about that now. She looked up at him. I admit that I can't forget you, but if, she choked. If you're going to get married one day, I'll leave. I can't be a man's mistress. Don't make things difficult for me then, okay? His gaze was heavy. He stared at her for a long time before he said okay. Her heart was a little broken, and she couldn't help hugging him. She felt that she wasn't worth it, and she looked down on herself. But Yi Mulin's existence was poison to her, and she thought that she was the same to him. Neither of them was better off than the other, and neither of them had it easy. They were both in pain. She hugged him and murmured, Will you look for me when I go to hell? No. He smiled. How could I bear to let you go? He hugged her, lowered his head, and kissed her again. After they got together again, today was the best time for them. There was no flirting, only the snuggling of an old married couple. After a long time, they walked forward again. The sun shone warmly on their bodies. However, he stopped after walking for about 100 meters. In front of him were Hao Yun and Su Fu. Two young couples and two old couples looked at each other. The atmosphere was a little awkward. Yi Mulin was the first to speak. He tilted his head and said to Bai Shuali, Didn't you say you wanted to see Mom? Why are you in a daze now? His words were very subtle. The other two people present could tell that he still regarded Bai Shuali as his wife. Only Bai Shuali herself could not tell. She immediately ran over and hugged Su Fu. She wanted to call her auntie, but she couldn't. She buried her face in Su Fu's arms and acted like a spoiled child. Hao Yun felt a sense of danger. He felt that the wife he had just gotten might not belong to him alone. There were so many people who would share it. Su Fu did not know his dark thoughts. He lowered his head and touched Bai Shuoli's head. "You're still like a child." Chapter 3567. Su Fu patted her gently and said in a low voice, "Shuoli, it's done." Bai Shuoli was still hugging him, not only because she was a little excited, but also because she was embarrassed. Actually, she felt uncomfortable, and so did Su Fu. She was an elder, and now that she was with another man, it would not look good on her. In the end, Bai Shuoli still went to Hao Yun and Su Fu's house as a guest. Su Fu made flower tea and snacks for Bai Shuoli. As usual, the two men went into the study room. In the small flower hall, Bai Shuoli looked at Su Fu and felt that she was a little different. Although she was still very loving, the magnetic field of her entire body was different, as if she could shine. She thought about it and thought of a word, which was being loved. It was because she was loved that she shone. She sipped the flower tea and asked softly, "Is Uncle Hao treating you well?" "Mom, are you happy?" "I'm happy." Su Fu patted her head. "Shuoli, do you think Mom isn't good?" Bai Shuoli shook her head. "No, Mom, you're very good." "Really?" She lowered her head. "It was Yi Mulin's father who didn't cherish you." Su Fu said softly, "You know." Bai Shuoli hummed, lowered her head, and said in a low voice, "Xia Ning, she is already dead." Su Fu's expression was momentarily stunned. After a long time, he smiled faintly. "That's a pity." As he said that, he raised his head. "I remember that she used to go to the old house often." How could a difficult girl be willing to follow Yi Zhengang? Yes, his position is very high, and he has the charm of a superior, but isn't it good to find a man of the same age to have a beautiful relationship? As Su Fu said that, he took a sip of the flower tea and sighed softly, "It's a pity." Bai Shuoli looked at him. She did not know if she should comfort Madame Yi at this moment. She felt that she should say something, but she was not sure. After a long time, she whispered, "Mom, are you with Uncle Hao for revenge, or do you really like him?" Su Fu's face reddened as he looked at Bai Shuoli. He took another sip of flower tea and said faintly, "Life is only so long, I'm not young anymore. Where would I find the time to think about revenge? Isn't that just torturing myself with the mistakes of others?" Bai Shuoli replied with an "oh" and lowered her head, looking very cute. Su Fu smiled. "Let's eat something." The two of them talked about something else. Bai Shuoli was still a little uneasy, which Su Fu could see and understand. She sighed in her heart. After going through so many things, this child was indeed different from before. After chatting for the whole afternoon, Su Fu asked them to stay for dinner. She and Hao Yun cooked together. Bai Shuoli and Yi Mulin were watching TV in the living room. Bai Shuoli fiddled with Yi Mulin for a while and said softly, "You don't look out of place at all." "What's out of place?" "As long as they are happy." Yi Mulin smiled faintly. "Do you want me to break them up?" She lowered her head. "I didn't mean that." He looked at her, lowered her head and said in a low voice, "I know, I'm just teasing you." She looked up at him with an expression as if how hateful he was. He smiled and reached out to hug her. It was very warm and natural, as if he was at his own home. Chapter 3568. Aren't they doing fine too? Yi Mulin pinched her cheeks. "We're doing fine too." Bai Shuoli bit her lips. "We're different from them, right?" How are we different? More or less. Yi Mulin smiled. Tell me about it. How could she be willing to tell him? She lowered her eyes and muttered, you know. He said deliberately, you're saying that we're living together illegally, right? You're right. Bai Shuali was angered by him and retorted softly, Uncle Hao doesn't have any other girlfriends. At the mention of this, she was a little bothered and did not say anything for a long time. He looked at her with a smile on his face. What's wrong? She said a little gloomily, nothing, and nothing can happen. She squeezed out of his embrace. He did not stop her, merely looking at her with a faint smile. After a while, he said softly, I won't like her. Bai Shuali tilted her head and looked at him. He smiled and pinched her cheeks. This wasn't a guarantee, and it made her feel even more conflicted and guilty. During the meal, Bai Shuali was a little absent-minded. Yi Mulin picked up a piece of meat and placed it in her bowl. Hurry up and eat. She looked at him. This piece of meat is so fat, it'll get fat. He picked up the meat and ate the fat part for himself, leaving the lean part for her. She was speechless, but under the gaze of 3 pairs of eyes, she still bit the bullet and ate the meat. It tasted pretty good. After eating, she looked at him eagerly. It was delicious, could she have another piece? Yi Mulin smiled faintly and picked up another piece of meat for her. She ate it carefully and smiled. It's really delicious, Mummy. Can I come here every day? Of course. Su Fu agreed. The other 2 men looked at each other speechlessly. However, there was nothing they could do as long as they were happy. Yi Mulin understood Hao Yun very well. After the meal, he took Bai Shuali away. She was still reluctant to leave as he stared at her. You still can't bear to leave. Are you staying for the new year? She walked in silence. It was a little cold, and it was useless to wrap her clothes around herself. In the end, she hugged his arm. It's going to be New Year soon. Yi Mulin's body stiffened for a moment, then he whispered, then, do you want to go back to Be City for the new year? She looked at him. Can I? Then, she stopped and said softly, Yi Mulin, can I make a New Year's wish? He looked straight at her and whispered, yes, no matter what it is, I'm willing to fulfill it for you. She took a step forward and gently hugged his waist. I want to celebrate the new year with Mom and Dad. I want to see them. Yi Mulin, am I stupid? I always feel that when I'm with them, none of this will happen. The Bai family will still be fine. The night was cold, and she was in his arms. His embrace was very warm. She knew that she shouldn't be greedy, but she couldn't help it. She whispered, Yi Mulin, I really feel guilty. I've let down my parents by being with you. As she spoke, she began to cry. She didn't cry out loud, just silently shed tears. Seeing her cry made him feel bad. He lowered his head and gently stroked her little head. Shuali, don't cry. Chapter 35-69. She did not say anything. She only hugged him in the cold night and absorbed a little bit of warmth from his body. She did not know how long she could hug him. 1 year, or 2 years. In her heart, she actually faintly knew that he and Wen Yuan had reached some sort of consensus regarding her existence. No matter how much she denied it, it would not change the fact that she was now a part of their perfect marriage. She did not want to think about the future. She just wanted to hug him now. Yi Mulin's chin rested on her little head. He did not speak and just hugged her. In the following days, he was very busy. She often went to Su Fu's place to disturb him. Fortunately, Hao Yun was also busy, so the 2 women could accompany each other. It was as if their days had returned to the past. However, this calmness was so calm that it made people flustered. In the blink of an eye, it was almost the new year. Yi Mulin was even busier than usual. At the beginning, Bai Shuali could only see him in the news. Just like how she used to see her father in the news, she would sometimes sit in front of the television in a daze. She did not know why he wanted to keep her by his side. She felt that he liked his current position, or a higher position. She was a little flustered. He treated her very well. Would there be a day when he would be like Yi Zhengang to Su Fu? No, that's not it. She was playing the role of Xia Anning. When Yuan was the role of Su Fu. She felt that it was a little sad. She sat in front of the television and watched her man. That night, he did not return past midnight, and tomorrow was New Year's Eve. She lay on the bed and did not fall asleep. She kept waiting for him. She did not know what she was persevering for. Tomorrow, she would return to Bi City. She would not be able to see her father, so she wanted to see her mother. Hearing that her mother's illness was much better, was perhaps the greatest comfort. When she was in a daze, she felt a gust of cold wind blowing past. When she opened her eyes, she saw Yi Mulin leaning against her side. He did not turn on the light and leaned against her as if he wanted to kiss her. She asked hoarsely, "What time is it?" Without waiting for him to reply, she said, "The sky seems very cold." He replied absent-mindedly, "It's 2 o'clock. I'm so tired." As he spoke, he laid down flat and placed a hand on his forehead. "But I can rest for 3 days." He tilted his head and looked at her in the dark, waiting for her surprise. Bai Shuali was shocked, but not happy. She stammered, "Aren't you Captain S? Shouldn't you stay here to work? What a cruel little thing." He pinched her face and said in a low voice, "Bai Shuali, who told you that Boss S has to work during the new year?" "I know." Her voice was a little soft as she looked at him. "Then where are you going to spend the new year?" "Your mom is here." He pulled her into his arms. She felt that his body was cold and wanted to struggle free. Yi Mulin took off his jacket, took off his shoes, and climbed into the blanket. She was so angry that she screamed, "You didn't even take off your shoes before climbing onto the bed. Yi Mulin, you're too hateful." He smiled and lay flat on the bed. His voice was a little low. "You don't like me anymore." As soon as he finished speaking, he pulled her into his arms and buried his face in her neck. Bai Shuali shouted angrily, "I smell smoke." "Yi Mulin, let go of me." He laughed. "I don't want to." As he smiled, he began to kiss her. As his lips became hotter and hotter, Bai Shuali's voice trembled. "Aren't you tired?" Chapter 35-70. Then, the kiss changed. She couldn't resist it and was completely burned. After it was over, he took a quick shower with her in his arms and lay on the bed, murmuring, "The plane will be at 8 tomorrow morning. Shuali, remember to wake me up." She looked at him. "Yi Mulin, are you going back to Bi City too?" He nodded and then closed his eyes. "Yes, let's go back together." She didn't say anything. She thought he was going back to Bi City for the new year. She closed her eyes and hugged him gently. Early in the morning, Yi Mulin woke up first. He opened his eyes and looked at the woman in his arms. He pinched her face. "Shuali, get up." She opened her eyes in a daze. She was more sleepy than he was. Yi Mulin smiled. "Get up. Otherwise, the plane will be late and we'll have to wait for a long time." He lifted the quilt and went to get clothes for her. As he put on his clothes, he said, "It's cold in Bi City." Wear an extra sweater. Bai Shuali put on the sweater and looked at him. Are you going back with me? After putting on the sweater and pants, he said calmly, didn't we agree last night when we did it? She blushed. What did he mean by agreeing last night? He was so shameless. He didn't even blush when he said those words. Bai Shuali put on the sweater and said in a low voice, it's not good. Yi Mulin walked beside her and whispered, I'll take you back first and then I'll go home. She looked at him and felt a little uneasy. Home? Did she still have a home? While she was in a daze, Yi Mulin had already picked her up and walked to the bathroom. He said lightly, brush your teeth and wash your face. If the plane doesn't arrive in time, your New Year's wish won't come true. She let out an "ah" and looked at him. He smiled and didn't say anything. At 8:00, the plane flew to B City. It was rare that he didn't deal with business. Instead, he was reading a magazine and then took a nap. Bai Shuali was at a loss, so she sat on the edge of the cabin and looked outside. When the plane landed, Yi Mulin woke up and said to her, I'll take you back. She shook her head. No need. I'll go to the hospital myself. He stared at her for a while. Let me take you. It's very convenient for a chauffeur to pick you up. She still wanted to say something, but she also realized that if she continued to refuse, it would seem a little strange, so she didn't say anything. The driver waited for them to come over and opened the car door for them. Yi Mulin sat in the car and closed his eyes to rest. He had been working for the past few days and only rested for 4 to 5 hours a day. Bai Shuali looked at the bruises at the corner of his eyes and whispered, You're so tired. Why did you? If you want to, then do it. He smiled and pulled her into his arms. Kissing her hair, he pressed his chin against her hair and murmured, Tomorrow, you'll go back to the apartment, okay? As he spoke, he held her hand. There was a key in her palm. She had left the key behind before she went to H City. Did he find out? Why? Her voice trembled. His eyes were still closed as he sighed softly. I want you to be there. I want to be able to find you at any time. As he spoke, he ruffled her hair. Bai Shuali, stop talking now. Let me sleep for a while. Chapter 3571. The car kept driving. Bai Shuali suddenly turned around and asked, Why is it here? Outside the car window, everything was so familiar that it made her heart tremble. It was the Bai residence. After the Bai family lost, it was confiscated. Later, she heard that it was auctioned. Why did he drive her here? The car stopped. Yi Mulin slowly turned his head and said softly, I bought this place. I've asked someone to pick up your father and your mother is in good spirits, but they only have one night. Your father has to go back and your mother is better off receiving treatment in the hospital. Someone will pick them up tomorrow morning. You, wait for me at the apartment. We'll go back to City H on the second night of the new year. She still looked at him and said in a hoarse voice, How did my father get out? Although he was only sentenced to 5 years, she knew that it was not an ordinary 5 years. It was difficult for her to even see him, let alone get him out for one night. He had taken a big risk. If others knew about it, his future would be gone. Yi Mulin looked at her and put his hand on her hair. His voice was warm. This is your New Year's wish. I have to find a way to satisfy it, right? Okay, good girl, I have to go. I'll pick you up at the apartment the day after tomorrow. She looked at him, still in a daze. He turned his body and reached out to open the car door for her. His voice was very low. It's not convenient for me to show up. Get out. She seemed to wake up from a dream. When she got out of the car, her steps were unsteady. At this moment, Yi Mulin rolled down the window and smiled. Happy New Year, Shuali. She hadn't come back to her senses yet. She said in a daze, Happy New Year. Then she watched the car window rise and the car drive away. Bai Shuali watched for a while before running into the villa. Mr. and Mrs. Bai were there. Mr. Bai had lost a lot of weight. He was squatting in front of Mrs. Bai and talking to her. Mrs. Bai seemed to be in good spirits. Bai Shuali stood on the stairs and looked at the familiar scene. Her eyes were warm and tears came out of her eyes. Dad, Mom. She walked in and hugged Mr. and Mrs. Bai. Mrs. Bai was in good spirits, but her brain was not very sensitive. She could not remember some things and thought that things were still the same as before, so she smiled and said, Shirley, why are you crazy again? Hurry up and wash your hands. Your father will celebrate the new year with us tonight, so he doesn't have to go out to visit the people anymore. He will accompany us today. When she said this, her spirit was indescribably happy. Bai Shuali felt a little sad when she saw this. She looked at her father, and Mr. Bai smiled faintly. She nodded. Yes, Dad won't be going out today. She still wanted to cry, but she quickly wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes and squeezed out a smile. This kind of reunion was not easy. She knew that Yi Mulin had paid a huge price for it. She could not mess it up. Perhaps the next time she could see her father would be a few years later. The reunion dinner was prepared by Mr. Bai himself. Mrs. Bai had been complaining that the servants at home had become lazy and no one was cooking. Bai Shuali said, Dad gave them a day off so that they could reunite. Mrs. Bai was happy again. She looked at Mr. Bai cooking. Bai Shuali looked at them and quietly went to the side. She wanted them to spend more time together. Chapter 35-72. She looked at her father's back as he cooked and felt that he had changed. In the past, her father was so high-spirited. So many people looked up to him. But now, it was different. His back looked so lonely. Bai Shuali's eyes were hot. She felt a little sour and wanted to cry. But, after so long, her tears had all dried up. During the meal, she almost didn't dare to look at her father. She was afraid of his penetrating gaze. After the meal, Mr. Bai coaxed Mrs. Bai to sleep. Then, he went downstairs and saw Bai Shuali leaning on the railing, looking at him silently. He looked at his daughter quietly. After a while, he walked over and handed her a cup of hot food. What are you looking at? Bai Shuali took the hot food and looked at her father. She said in a low voice, I'm looking at the night view. I'm thinking that if everything returned to the past, maybe I wouldn't have married into the Yi family. She paused, her eyes watery. Dad, I hurt you. It's just a matter of time, Shuali. This has nothing to do with you. Mr. Bai sat beside his daughter and looked at the boundless night with her. He sighed. It's just brought forward. But Shuali, it's because of Yi Mulin that your father's sentence was reduced by so many years. You might not know that if you want to step on someone, it's best to kill them in prison. 5 years is really a gift. He looked at his daughter. Bai Shuali looked at him in shock. Mr. Bai smiled faintly. Even this time, he took the risk to come forward. Otherwise, how would I be able to come out? He smiled bitterly and reached out to touch Bai Shuali's head. Dad doesn't object to you being with him. That man loves you. But you have to think about whether you want to sacrifice yourself for Mom and Dad. His father is not a soft-hearted person. Bai Shuali was silent for a moment. It's probably karma. Yi Xinggang got divorced. Yi Mulan's mother is now with Hao Yun. Mr. Bai was a little surprised. He looked at his daughter and did not speak for a long time. Bai Shuali told him about Xia Anning. Mr. Bai laughed coldly. In the end, he fell into the hands of a woman. Su Fu was such a good woman, yet he let her down. When he said this, Mr. White's face looked a little bleak. It was as if he had received a lot of information. Bai Shuali stared blankly at her father. Mr. Bai smiled and said, Su Fu was recognized as the national goddess. Everyone liked her. Your father was still a loser in the early days. He could only look at her from afar. Surely, you can't tell your mother about this. Bai Shuali laughed and said, Dad, you even have this part. Mr. Bai smoked a cigarette and said faintly, what hasn't your father experienced? Life is full of ups and downs. Ups and downs are no big deal. After I come out, I don't have much to hope for. I'll just rely on your mother and find a job to support her. I owe her a lot. I'll make it up to her in the future. Chapter 3573. Bai Shuali nodded in agreement. Mr. Bai said a lot more, because he didn't know when they would meet again. He talked until the middle of the night. She said she was sleepy, and she wanted her father to stay with her mother. Late at night, Mr. Bai stood in the luxurious living room for a long time before he said, when I come out, let's move to another house. It's too big and not practical. Bai Shuali nodded in agreement, let's move to another level. She was sobbing as she said, Dad, you have to come back in one piece, okay? Mom and I will be waiting for you. Mr. Bai touched his daughter's hair and nodded in agreement. He turned and walked upstairs. Although they were resting, who could sleep? After a short night, the family of three was destined to go their separate ways again. It was a sleepless night until the sound of firecrackers was heard. Bai Shuali seemed to have heard the noise downstairs. She immediately got up, put on a coat and ran downstairs. There were two black cars parked at the entrance. Mrs. Bai was already in one of them and Mr. Bai was about to get in. Bai Shuali stood on the stairs and called out to her father. Mr. White turned around and looked at her. He gave her a small smile. Surely. Bai Shuali's face was pale and she called out to her father. Then, she rushed over and hugged Mr. Bai. Dad. Mr. Bai lowered his head and said softly, it's only 3 years. Shuali, don't be sad and don't ask him for anything. It's dangerous, okay? She knew. She looked up and nodded, but she couldn't help but feel sad. Mr. Bai comforted her. He had been a leader before and wasn't as weak as Bai Shuali. But he still left. When he closed the car door, he couldn't bear it. It was his fault that he couldn't protect his wife and child. The two cars started slowly and went their separate ways. Bai Shuali stood at the entrance of the Bai residence and watched. Her tears were about to fall, but she held them back. She returned to the living room. Mr. Bai had prepared breakfast for her. It was still warm. There was a pair of handmade slippers on the sofa. It should have been made by her mother. She finished her breakfast quietly and held the slippers in her hands. She didn't stay in the villa for long and left. It was the first day of the new year. There were still firecrackers everywhere, but she was facing a farewell. Suddenly, she missed Yi Mulan very much. She wanted to see him. She took out her phone and dialed his number, but the sound of the phone being turned off came from the other end. She was stunned for a long time and did not come back to her senses. After a long time, she slowly walked forward. A taxi stopped in front of her and asked if she wanted a ride. She sobered up and thought for a moment before smiling. Okay. She sat in the car, and the driver asked the young lady where she was going. She should go to the apartment, but she didn't want to. In the end, she said, I'll just walk around B-City. Baishuali said blankly. The driver agreed and started to drive around. It was the new year, and B-City was deserted in the morning. Baishuali sat in the car and watched quietly until her eyes felt a little sore. She then gave the driver an address, but she was absent-minded and told him the address of the Yi family's old mansion. Chapter 3574. The driver worked very hard to pull her over. When they arrived, Baishuali paid the driver without even looking. The driver drove the car away as soon as he saw Xian. However, when she got out of the car, she realized that the place she got out of the car was the Yi family's old house. The Hui-style building was very grand, and it looked very imposing in the cold morning of B-City. She looked at it quietly, as if a lifetime had passed. She stood there, motionless. She stood there silently for a long time. There were her best and worst memories. She turned her head, and a black motor home stopped behind her silently. In the car, Yi Mulin sat quietly, and when Yuan was beside him, Baishuali looked into his eyes. Their eyes were glued to each other, and her heart twitched. In the car, Yi Mulin's hands were holding the steering wheel very tightly. He looked at Baishuali quietly. When Yuan, who was beside him, looked at Baishuali, and then looked at the man beside him, he asked softly, "Do you want to get out of the car to meet her?" In front of their car was Wen Yuan's father's car. Wen Yuan was considerate, but he couldn't accept this kindness. He said calmly, "No need." As he said that, he pressed the button, and the majestic black door of the Yi family's house opened immediately. Yi Mulin's car slowly slid in, and he passed by Baishuali. When he passed by her, he saw the tears in the corner of her eyes and saw how lonely she looked. This was originally her home, but now she was standing there like a stranger. "But Shuali, you don't know that this is not my home anymore." Yi Mulin closed his eyes, and when Yuan put his hand on the back of his hand, he smiled gently. "Coax her later." Yi Mulin's voice was a little depressed. "Wen Yuan, are you tired?" He didn't slap her hand away, but his expression was distant. He stopped the car and said quietly, "A marriage that looks united but is actually divided is not good. Wen Yuan, are you sure you want to do this?" Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and smiled faintly. "It's all for the clan, isn't it?" She looked at Baishuali through the rearview mirror and smiled. "I envy her. She is willful no matter what, but she has always been able to live a good life. Mulin, we are the same kind of people, but she doesn't belong to our world. You can take care of her and pamper her. I don't mind, but I won't ruin your relationship. If these things can make you happier, I am willing to indulge you." He tilted his head and looked at Wen Yuan. "Shuali is the same type of person as my mother. I've heard a statistic that men will instinctively like women who are the same type as their mother. I don't know if this is true, but it seems like Mu Bai is the same." At the mention of Yi Mu Bai, Wen Yuan's expression changed slightly. Yi Mulin's gaze deepened. He leaned forward and asked in a low voice, "You really don't want to consider Mu Bai? Are you sure you like a boring person like me?" Mu Bai knows a lot, and he might be able to stir up your calm heart. Under his words, Wen Yuan was flustered. She opened the car door and got out. After getting out of the car, her heart was heaving up and down. She kept adjusting her breathing, telling herself that it must be her imagination. Yi Mulin definitely wouldn't know that she and Yi Mu Bai slept together after drinking. Yimubai, that bastard, said that he wouldn't tell anyone and said that they would part ways. Yi Mulin got out of the car. When he got out, he looked outside. Bai Shuali was already gone. Chapter 35-75. When Yuan looked at Yimubai's poker face, he was sure that he didn't know. As for Yimubai, she could only say sorry. That night was an accident. Since it was an accident, it was fine to stop there. She couldn't continue to make mistakes with him, so she had been avoiding him these days. However, she didn't expect that today's gathering was not only attended by the parents of both sides, but also by Yimubai. Wasn't he abroad? Why did he come back? When Yuan's gaze was a little uncomfortable, and his hand holding Yi Mulin's tightened. Yi Mulin asked calmly, "What's wrong?" When Yuan forced a smile, "Nothing." At this time, Yimubai walked over. When Yuan immediately let go of Yi Mulin's hand, "I'll go talk to Auntie for a while." Because it was a marriage event, Su Fu also came, but not as Yi Zhenggang's wife, but as Yi Mulin's mother. Yi Mulin watched her leave, and then turned to look at his brother. "Why are you back?" Yimubai smiled faintly. "We're back for a family reunion, but it seems that one person is missing." He walked to the bar, poured a glass of wine for himself and Yi Mulin, and then walked to the balcony with Yi Mulin. Yimubai looked at his brother with an unfriendly expression. "Did you put the drug on us that night?" Yi Mulin squinted, smiled, and took a sip of wine. "What drug? Who is we?" Yimubai stared at him, and wanted to grab his collar. "Don't pretend to be innocent. You don't know." "Oh. You mean when I was sick, when Yuan saw Shuali complaining to you, and you slept with her?" Yi Mulin patted his brother's shoulder and said earnestly and lovingly, "Ha, I asked you to comfort her, not to sleep with her. Mubai is my future wife after all. Can you restrain yourself a little? It won't look good if it gets out." Yimubai was furious. Why? Why did he have to sleep with someone his brother didn't want to marry? He said coldly, "I don't believe you will marry her." Yi Mulin smiled. "Since you knew, why did you still sleep with her?" His meaning was too obvious. Yimubai's face darkened. "Yi Mulin, I find that you're becoming more and more black-bellied." Yi Mulin patted his shoulder. "For the family, I sacrificed myself for you once. Shouldn't it be your turn now?" Then, he smiled and walked towards the head of the Wen family. He looked like he was preparing a son-in-law. Yimubai spat out angrily. Did these fools really expect Yi Mulin to marry Wen Yuan? He was merely stalling for time. Wen Yuan was merely a springboard for him to jump to be city. Wen Yuan was foolish, and the Wen family was even more foolish. But the biggest idiot was him, Yimubai. He knew it clearly, but he still fell for it. When he thought about Wen Yuan's lukewarm expression, his scalp went numb. He was the perfect wife, but not the one he wanted. The Yi family seemed to be in a harmonious mood. But everyone had their own thoughts. The Wen family had lunch here and then left. Yi Mulin sent Wen Yuan away, and Su Fu was also going to leave. She contacted Hao Yun, and Hao Yun said that he would be back in half an hour, so she waited in the living room downstairs. Yi Zhengang walked over and put a cup of scented tea in front of her. "He hasn't come yet." Su Fu nodded. "There's a little traffic jam on the road." She looked at the scented tea, which was the kind she used to like to drink, so she smiled. "Thank you." Chapter 35-76. However, Yi Xiaolong didn't show it because that would make him look too lowly. He sat beside her and asked casually, "Does he treat you well?" Su Fu froze for a moment, probably not expecting him to ask such a question. She smiled. Not bad. Yi Xinggang wanted to say something more, but Su Fu said softly, I got my marriage certificate with him. Then, Yi Xinggang went silent for a long time. His face was indescribably gloomy, as though every frown on his face was filled with disappointment. After a long time, he sighed. Su Fu, you're not giving me any chance at all. Su Fu was much calmer now. She said softly, don't be like that. I can't be with him without any status. I'm already so old, so I have to be decent. Yi Xinggang had just recovered from the shock, so he asked, what about his family? Do they treat you well? They're all pretty good, Su Fu smiled. Because of my status, I can't do much. Just having a meal with my family is good enough. Yi Xinggang lowered his eyes and didn't say anything for a long time. Later on, Hao Yun came over. He and Yi Xinggang almost didn't contact each other anymore. Some things were handled by Secretary Li. When Yi Xinggang looked at Hao Yun again, it was as though a lifetime had passed and there was an indescribable feeling in his heart. He watched as Hao Yun held Su Fu's waist and got into the car. He was especially considerate. He thought that she must be happy to be loved by someone wholeheartedly. Suddenly, he called out to her. Su Fu, wait up. Su Fu sat in the car and rolled down the window to look at him. Yi Xinggang turned around and went to the study room. He took out a set of precious mahogany screens for her. It was carved by a master and had a high collection value. Su Fu had always liked it. He placed it in her hand and smiled. Live a good life from now on. His eyes were fixed on her as he said this. She was still that beautiful woman, but he was no longer that high-spirited Yi Xinggang. Su Fu smiled. Thank you. Hao Yun nodded at Yi Xinggang, walked around, opened the door, and started the car. In fact, Hao Yun knew very well that Yi Xinggang would let him go because he still loved Su Fu. However, that kind of love, after being crippled, was hard to come back. A woman like Su Fu was, after all, proud and unwilling to compromise. In the car, Su Fu looked at the small screen and put it down. Put it in your study later. Hao Yun smiled gently. Don't mind me, as long as you like it. No. Su Fu sighed. I don't like it so much now. It's true that I like reading, but, she suddenly tilted her head and looked at Hao Yun. Because you like me like this. For her sudden confession, Hao Yun's ears were a little hot and red. He held her hand and said softly, save these words for me when we get home, okay? She smiled slightly and looked out of the car window. The New Year's firecrackers had been going off all the time, indicating the arrival of a new year and the beginning of everything. She sighed faintly. I always feel that I'm sorry for your parents if I can't have a child. Hao Yun was the only son. His parents were old professors at Tsinghua University. They came from a famous family. It was a little unfair for him to marry her, and then he didn't have a child. She was still worried. Hao Yun held her hand. Don't force it. It's always in your life. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.